The November rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Manhattan penthouse like an angry symphony, each droplet a sharp reminder that nature cared nothing for power or prestige. Marcus Wellington stood motionless before the glass, his reflection a ghost against the backdrop of the glittering city skyline. At 42 years old, he had built an empire from nothing, Wellington Capital Management, a hedge fund that controlled over $3 billion in assets. His navy suit, tailored on Savile Row, fit him like armor. His steel-grey eyes, the ones that had stared down competitors in boardrooms across Wall Street, now watched the storm with cold calculation. Behind him, the penthouse sprawled in minimalist luxury, white marble floors, contemporary art that cost more than most people's homes, furniture that prioritized design over comfort. Everything was perfect, everything was controlled. Everything was exactly as Marcus had designed it, because Marcus Wellington did not believe in accidents or coincidences. He believed in strategy, execution, and the ruthless elimination of anything that stood between him and success. His phone buzzed on the glass desk. He didn't move to answer it. He knew who it was, his assistant, probably calling about tomorrow's meeting with the Securities and Exchange Commission. A routine audit, they'd said. Nothing to worry about. Marcus had heard those words before, had spoken them himself to nervous clients when markets trembled. He knew they meant everything. The phone stopped buzzing, started again. This time, Marcus turned from the window and picked it up. "Wellington," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Mr. Wellington, it's Sarah. His assistant's voice cracked, something he'd never heard in the 7 years she'd worked for him. "Sir, you need to turn on CNBC, right now." Marcus reached for the remote, his movements precise despite the ice forming in his chest. The television flickered to life, revealing a familiar face, David Chen, his chief financial officer, being led out of the Wellington Capital offices in handcuffs. The banner scrolling across the bottom of the screen made his blood run cold. Wellington Capital executives arrested in massive fraud scheme. Estimated losses, $2.7 billion. "This cannot be happening," Marcus whispered, the words foreign in his mouth. He never whispered, he commanded. The news anchor's voice filled the penthouse. "In a stunning development tonight, federal prosecutors have arrested 3 top executives at Wellington Capital Management, alleging a sophisticated Ponzi scheme that has defrauded investors of billions. The firm's CEO, Marcus Wellington, is currently being sought for questioning. Sources say the fraud may have been ongoing for over 5 years. The remote slipped from Marcus's hand, clattering against the marble floor. 5 years. That's when he'd brought David on board, when he'd trusted someone other than himself to handle the firm's internal accounting. That's when he'd been so focused on expansion, on conquering new markets, that he'd stopped looking at the details. His phone exploded with calls, clients, board members, his lawyer, the press. Marcus stared at the device as if it were a venomous snake, watching name after name flash across the screen. Each call represented a relationship built on trust, on the promise that Marcus Wellington never failed, never faltered, never lost. He had just lost everything. The next 72 hours blurred into a nightmare of depositions, emergency meetings, and the systematic destruction of everything Marcus had built. His lawyer, Gerald Friedman, sat across from him in a conference room that smelled of stale coffee and desperation, his face grave. "Marcus, listen to me very carefully," Gerald said, leaning forward. "The feds have David, Michael, and Patricia dead to rights. The paper trail is extensive. They moved money through offshore accounts, created false statements, fabricated returns. It's textbook fraud." "I didn't know," Marcus said, his voice hoarse from hours of repeating the same words to different investigators. "I trusted them. I trusted David." "I believe you," Gerald replied, though his tone suggested that belief was a luxury they couldn't afford. "The problem is proving it. Your name is on the company. You signed off on quarterly reports. To the outside world, you either knew and participated, or you were criminally negligent. Either way, you're responsible." Marcus stood and walked to the window. This conference room looked out over Wall Street, the beating heart of American capitalism, the place where he'd made his fortune. From here, the people below looked like ants, scurrying about their insignificant lives. He'd always felt superior to them, above them. Now, he was about to become one of them, or worse. "What are my options?" he asked. Gerald sighed. "Cooperate fully, pay back every cent you can, and pray the criminal charges don't stick. Your assets are being frozen as we speak. The penthouse, the cars, the vacation homes, all of it's going into receivership. The trustee will liquidate everything to pay back investors." "Everything." "Everything!" Marcus turned to face his lawyer. "How long do I have?" "The marshal will be at your penthouse tomorrow morning at 9. You can take personal items only, clothes, photographs, things with sentimental value. Everything else stays." "Sentimental value." Marcus almost laughed. He'd spent 20 years eliminating sentiment from his life, treating it as a weakness that clouded judgment. Now, it was the only thing he was allowed to keep, and he had none of it. That night, Marcus stood in his penthouse for the last time. He'd sent Sarah away, ignored his phone, poured himself a glass of 25-year-old scotch that would soon belong to someone else. The rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean and glittering with false promise. He thought about his ex-wife, Rebecca, who'd left him 8 years ago. "You're not a man, Marcus," she'd said, tears streaming down her face. "You're a calculating machine. You don't love me. You don't love anything except your precious numbers and your precious success." He'd let her go without a fight, relieved to eliminate the emotional complication from his life. Now, he wondered if she'd been right. He tried to remember the last time he'd felt something genuine: joy, sorrow, love, anything. The memories were there, faint and dusty, from before his father died and left him with nothing but debt and determination. Before he'd decided that feelings were liabilities and success was the only metric that mattered. His phone buzzed one final time. A text from Gerald. "U.S. Attorney's Office has agreed not to file criminal charges if you cooperate fully and forfeit all assets. Consider yourself lucky. Most people in your position would be in prison." Lucky. Marcus stared at the word until it lost all meaning. The next morning dawned cold and clear, the kind of November day that made New York feel alive with possibility. Marcus stood in the lobby of his former building with 2 suitcases containing his entire life. Some clothes, a few books, a photograph of his parents from before the cancer took his father. The doorman, Carlos, who'd greeted him every morning for 6 years, couldn't meet his eyes. "Mr. Wellington," Carlos said quietly, "I'm sorry about all this. You were always good to me." Marcus wanted to say something gracious, something that acknowledged Carlos's humanity, but the words felt strange in his mouth. Instead, he nodded and walked out into the cold morning air. He had $947 in his wallet, cash he'd had on hand that wasn't subject to the asset freeze. He had no credit cards, no access to his bank accounts, no friends who would answer his calls now that he was worthless. He stood on the sidewalk, suitcases in hand, and realized he had nowhere to go. A taxi pulled up, disgorging a young couple laughing and kissing, oblivious to his presence. Marcus watched them disappear into the building, his building, and felt something crack inside his chest, not his heart. He wasn't sure he had one of those anymore, but something fundamental, some core belief about the world and his place in it. He picked up his suitcases and started walking. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to move, had to put distance between himself and the ruins of his former life. The November wind cut through his expensive suit, and for the first time in 20 years, Marcus Wellington felt the cold. As he walked, the neighborhoods changed. The gleaming towers of Midtown gave way to the crowded streets of Chelsea, then the artistic chaos of the West Village. Marcus's feet ached in his Italian leather shoes, shoes that cost more than some people made in a month. His arms burned from carrying the suitcases. But he kept walking, one foot in front of the other, because stopping meant confronting the question that terrified him more than any bankruptcy or investigation. Now what? The Lower East Side smelled different than Manhattan's financial district, a mixture of fried food, exhaust fumes, and something Marcus couldn't quite identify, but that seemed to pulse with raw, unfiltered life. He'd been walking for 3 hours, his designer shoes now scuffed and painful, his shoulders screaming from the weight of the suitcases. The sun hung low over the buildings, casting long shadows across streets that seemed worlds away from the polished corridors of power he'd inhabited just days ago. Marcus stopped at the corner of Delancey and Essex, setting down his luggage with a grunt of relief. His stomach growled. He hadn't eaten since yesterday, and even then, he'd only managed a few bites of toast before the nausea of his situation overwhelmed him. Around him, the neighborhood hummed with evening activity. Street vendors called out in Spanish and Chinese, advertising their goods. Young professionals hurried past, heading home from jobs they probably complained about but would panic to lose. Families gathered on stoops, their laughter and conversation creating a symphony of normalcy that felt alien to Marcus's ears. "You lost, man." Marcus turned to find a teenager, maybe 17 or 18, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. The kid wore a Yankees cap and a jacket that had seen better days. "No," Marcus said automatically, then reconsidered. "Yes, I need a place to stay, something cheap." The teenager's eyes flicked to Marcus's suit, his expensive watch, one of the few things the marshals had somehow missed, and his leather suitcases. "Cheap? You don't look like you do cheap." "Things change," Marcus said flatly. The kid studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. "There's a place on Rivington, Mrs. Chen's boarding house. She takes anybody who can pay cash and doesn't cause trouble. $200 a week for a room." $200 a week. Marcus did the math instinctively. At that rate, his $947 would last barely a month. Then what? But he nodded his thanks, and the teenager gave him directions before disappearing into the crowd. Mrs. Chen's boarding house was a narrow brick building, squeezed between a laundromat and a bodega, its facade tired but clean. Marcus climbed the worn steps and knocked on the door, each rap of his knuckles feeling like another step away from his former life. The woman who answered was small and ancient, her face a map of wrinkles that somehow made her eyes seem sharper, more knowing. She looked Marcus up and down with the practiced assessment of someone who'd seen every type of human desperation. "You want room?" she asked, her English heavily accented but clear. "Yes, I can pay $200 for the week, 2 weeks advance. No drugs, no noise after 10, no guests overnight. You break my rules, you leave." "Understand." Marcus pulled out $400, watching his safety net shrink. "I understand." Mrs. Chen counted the bills twice, then gestured for him to follow her up a narrow staircase that creaked with each step. The boarding house smelled of cooking oil and old wood, sounds of life filtering through thin walls, a television playing in Spanish, a baby crying, someone practicing scales on a violin. The sensory overload made Marcus's head spin. "Here," Mrs. Chen said, unlocking a door on the 3rd floor. "Bathroom down hall. You share with 3 others. Keep clean." The room was perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet, smaller than Marcus's former walk-in closet. A narrow bed, a dresser with a cracked mirror, a single window looking out onto a brick wall. The radiator clanked and hissed, providing heat that felt like a living thing after the climate-controlled perfection of the penthouse. "It's fine," Marcus heard himself say, though fine was a word that had lost all meaning. Mrs. Chen handed him a key. "You look like man with troubles. Many people here have troubles. We don't ask questions. You want advice from old woman?" Marcus almost said no. He'd spent his entire adult life not needing anyone's advice, but something in her knowing eyes stopped him. "What's your advice?" "Troubles pass. Pride stays forever if you let it. Sometimes staying alive more important than staying proud." She patted his arm with surprising gentleness. "You eat dinner? I make extra soup tonight. Kitchen is downstairs." After she left, Marcus sat on the bed and stared at his reflection in the cracked mirror. The man looking back seemed like a stranger, pale, unshaven, with eyes that held a hollowness he'd never seen before. He thought about calling someone, anyone, but who? His entire network had been built on his success, his usefulness, his power. Without those things, he was nobody. The smell of soup drifted up through the floorboards, and his stomach cramped with hunger. Marcus Wellington, who'd eaten at Michelin-starred restaurants and hosted parties catered by celebrity chefs, found himself drawn by the promise of free soup in a boarding house kitchen. The kitchen was small and crowded, with a long table where 5 other residents sat eating. They looked up when Marcus entered, their conversations dying for a moment before resuming in lower tones. He felt their assessment, their curiosity about the man in the expensive suit carrying cheap luggage. Mrs. Chen ladled soup into a chipped bowl and set it before him with a chunk of bread. "Eat, you too skinny." The soup was simple, vegetables and chicken in a broth flavored with ginger and garlic. But when Marcus took his first spoonful, something unexpected happened. Tears burned his eyes, not from sadness or self-pity, but from the shock of tasting something real, something made with care rather than purchased as a status symbol. "First time in Chen kitchen?" asked the man sitting across from him. He was middle-aged, with paint-stained hands and a kind smile. "She's the best cook in the neighborhood. I'm Raymond, by the way. I paint apartments." "Marcus," he replied, the word feeling strange without the Wellington attached to it. "What brings you to our little corner of paradise, Marcus?" Raymond asked, gesturing at the worn kitchen with genuine affection. Marcus considered lying, crafting some story that preserved his dignity. But what was the point? "I lost everything. My business, my home, my reputation. I'm starting over." The words hung in the air. Marcus waited for judgment, for the questions that would expose the full extent of his failure. Instead, Raymond nodded, as if Marcus had told him the weather forecast. "Well, you're in good company here. Most of us have lost something. The trick is figuring out what you want to find." He pushed the bread closer to Marcus. "Eat up. Tomorrow's problems are easier to face on a full stomach." That night, Marcus lay in the narrow bed and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the boarding house, footsteps in the hallway, conversations in languages he didn't speak, the distant wail of sirens, the rattling of the ancient radiator. For 20 years, he'd slept in silence, temperature-controlled, insulated from the messiness of ordinary human existence. Now, surrounded by the chaos of real life, Marcus Wellington couldn't sleep. But for the first time since the news broke, he wasn't thinking about what he'd lost. He was thinking about Mrs. Chen's words, "Troubles pass, pride stays forever." He'd built his entire identity on pride, on being above and better than everyone else. That pride had left him alone, friendless, and sleeping in a 10 by 12-foot room with his entire life packed into 2 suitcases. Maybe it was time to let the pride go. Maybe it was time to figure out who Marcus was when he couldn't hide behind wealth and power and success. The next morning, Marcus woke to pale sunlight filtering through the grimy window. His body ached from the unfamiliar mattress, and his stomach reminded him that one bowl of soup didn't erase days of barely eating. He dressed in his least expensive suit, though even that probably cost more than most of his fellow boarders made in a month, and ventured out into the neighborhood. The Lower East Side looked different in daylight, less menacing and more vibrant. Marcus walked without destination, observing the rhythm of the streets with the same intensity he'd once applied to market analysis. He saw the way vendors set up their stalls with practiced efficiency, how neighbors greeted each other with genuine warmth, how people navigated their lives without the insulation of wealth. On the corner of Orchard and Rivington, a small crowd had gathered around a food cart. The smell drew Marcus closer. Grilled meat, fresh vegetables, something spicy and enticing that made his empty stomach clench with need. He approached the cart and found himself staring at a menu board written in both English and Spanish, offering tacos, tortas and quesadillas at prices that seemed impossibly low. "What can I get you?" asked a voice, and Marcus looked up into the most striking face he'd ever seen. The woman behind the cart was perhaps 35, with dark eyes that held both intelligence and wariness, her black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore a simple apron over jeans and a sweater, and her hands moved with confident efficiency as she prepared food for her customers. There was nothing extraordinary about her appearance. No designer clothes, no expensive jewelry, no artifice. Yet Marcus found himself unable to look away. "What do you recommend?" he asked, the question feeling absurdly inadequate. She studied him with those dark eyes, and Marcus had the uncomfortable sensation of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. "You look like someone who doesn't know what he wants. Try the carnitas tacos. If you don't like them, I'll refund your money." "How much?" $7 for 3. $7. He'd spent more than that on a single cup of coffee in his old life. Marcus pulled out a $10 bill. "I'll take them." She prepared the tacos with practiced grace, each movement economical and precise. Marcus watched, fascinated by the care she took despite the simple task. When she handed him the paper-wrapped tacos, their fingers brushed for just a moment, and he felt something electric pass between them. Or maybe he imagined it, desperate for any human connection. $3 change, she said, holding out the bills. "Keep it." Her eyes narrowed. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity. It's a tip for good service. You haven't tasted the food yet. How do you know it's good?" Marcus unwrapped one of the tacos and took a bite. The flavors exploded in his mouth. Tender pork, fresh cilantro, tangy salsa, all balanced perfectly. It was, without exaggeration, the best thing he'd eaten in years. All those Michelin stars, all that molecular gastronomy and artistic presentation couldn't compete with the simple perfection of real food made with skill and care. "It's extraordinary," he said honestly. "What's your name?" She hesitated, as if giving her name meant something. Sophia Rodriguez." "I'm Marcus Wellington." He said his full name without thinking, then immediately regretted it. Would she recognize it from the news? Would she see him as the fraud, the failed tycoon, the cautionary tale? But Sophia just nodded. "Nice to meet you, Marcus. Enjoy your tacos." She turned to help the next customer, dismissing him as easily as she'd engaged him. Marcus moved away from the cart, finding a nearby stoop where he could eat and watch her work. She moved through the lunch rush with remarkable efficiency, somehow managing to serve customers, prepare food, and maintain conversation all at once. People clearly knew her. They asked about her day, shared jokes, treated her with the kind of casual affection that spoke of long familiarity. Marcus finished his tacos slowly, savoring each bite while he watched Sophia Rodriguez work her small corner of the world. She had something he'd never possessed, the kind of contentment that came from knowing your place and being at peace with it. She didn't need to conquer or dominate or prove anything. She simply existed, fully present in each moment, connected to the people around her in ways Marcus had never allowed himself to be. When the lunch rush ended, Sophia began cleaning her cart. Marcus stood, intending to return to the boarding house, but found himself walking back toward her instead. "Excuse me," he said, his voice uncertain in a way it hadn't been since he was a teenager. "Are you hiring?" Sophia looked up, surprise flickering across her face. "Hiring? Why would you want to work at a food cart? You're wearing a $2,000 suit. I need a job, and you seem busy enough to need help. I can't afford to pay much. Minimum wage. Cash at the end of each day. The work is hot, greasy and exhausting. You'd be on your feet for 8 hours, dealing with hungry people who aren't always polite." "I'll take it," Marcus said, surprised by his own certainty. Sophia studied him for a long moment, and Marcus had the sense that she was weighing something far more complex than whether he could competently make tacos. "Why?" she finally asked. "You're clearly educated, obviously from money, even if you've hit hard times. Why a food cart?" Marcus could have lied. Could have crafted some story about wanting to understand the common man or research for a future business venture. But standing there in the November cold, facing this woman who seemed to see straight through every wall he'd ever built, he chose truth instead. "Because I don't know how to do anything real," he said quietly. "I've spent 20 years manipulating numbers and making money from money, and it turns out I wasn't even good at that. I let people who trusted me get hurt because I was too arrogant to pay attention. Your tacos are the first real thing I've experienced in longer than I can remember. I want to learn how to make something real." The silence stretched between them, and Marcus braced himself for rejection or worse, pity. Instead, Sophia smiled, a small, genuine expression that transformed her entire face. "Okay, Marcus Wellington, you can start tomorrow morning, 5 a.m. sharp." Don't be late, and don't expect me to go easy on you just because you're going through something. If you can't keep up, you're gone. Understood? Understood. As Marcus walked back to the boarding house, the November sun breaking through the clouds, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 decades, a spark of something that might, eventually, become hope. The alarm on Marcus's phone, one of the few possessions the marshals hadn't confiscated, shrieked at 4:15 in the morning. He'd barely slept, his body refusing to adjust to the lumpy mattress and the constant symphony of the boarding house at night. Someone on the second floor had argued until 2 a.m., their raised voices carrying through the thin walls in a language Marcus didn't understand, but whose anger needed no translation. He dressed in the darkness, pulling on the most casual clothes he owned, dark slacks and a button-down shirt that still probably cost more than Sophia paid herself in a week. His Italian leather shoes were scuffed and uncomfortable, wholly inappropriate for standing on pavement all day, but they were all he had. Marcus looked at himself in the cracked mirror and barely recognized the man staring back, unshaven, exhausted, dressed like someone pretending to be normal. The streets of the Lower East Side were nearly empty at 4:45, just a few delivery trucks making their early rounds, and the occasional person heading home from a night shift. The November air bit through Marcus's thin jacket, and he realized with a start that he'd need to buy warmer clothes soon. Another expense he'd never had to consider before, when his closets were full of cashmere and wool tailored to perfection. Sophia's cart was parked at the same corner, but it looked different in the pre-dawn darkness. Smaller somehow, more vulnerable. A light glowed from inside, and Marcus could see Sophia's silhouette moving around, preparing for the day. He approached quietly, suddenly nervous in a way he'd never been before board meetings or investor presentations. "You're early," Sophia said without turning around. "That's good. Shows you're serious." "I'm always punctual," Marcus replied, then winced at how pretentious he sounded. Sophia finally turned to face him, taking in his outfit with an expression that might have been amusement. "You can't work in those clothes. You'll ruin them in an hour." She pulled a folded apron from a plastic bin and tossed it to him. "This will help, but you need to buy work clothes today. Jeans, comfortable shoes, clothes you don't mind getting stained and smelling like grilled meat." Marcus tied on the apron, the simple act feeling strange and significant. "Where do I start?" "First lesson. Everything is about preparation. We do 2 hours of prep before we serve a single customer. Chop vegetables, marinate meat, make salsa, prepare toppings. The better your prep, the smoother your service. Watch me first, then you'll do it." What followed was a masterclass in efficiency that would have impressed even Marcus's most demanding business professors. Sophia moved through her tasks with practiced precision, dicing onions with a speed that seemed dangerous but never was, mixing spices in proportions she'd clearly memorized, arranging her workspace so that everything was within easy reach. She narrated as she worked, explaining the reasoning behind each decision. "See how I cut the cilantro at the last minute? If you do it too early, it wilts and loses flavor. The tomatoes for pico de gallo need to be firm. Too ripe and they get mushy. The avocados have to be perfect, not too hard, not too soft. You learn to feel it." She demonstrated, her fingers pressing gently against the fruit skin. "Here, you try." Marcus picked up an avocado, mimicking her gesture. "Like this? Too hard. Try another." He went through 5 avocados before Sophia nodded approval. "That one's good. Now pit it and dice it. Like this." She demonstrated with swift, confident movements, the knife dancing through the flesh without ever coming close to her fingers. When Marcus tried, he was painfully slow, his cuts uneven and clumsy. The knife felt foreign in his hand, a tool he'd never needed when his entire career involved nothing more physical than typing and signing documents. "You're thinking too much," Sophia said, not unkindly. "This isn't strategy or analysis, it's muscle memory. Your body needs to learn, not your brain. Do it again." By the time the sun rose at 6:32, Marcus's hands were cramping. His back ached from standing, and he'd managed to cut himself twice. Minor nicks that Sophia treated with band-aids from a well-stocked first aid kit. "Everybody bleeds their first day," she said, wrapping the bandage around his finger. The question is whether you quit or keep going. I don't quit, Marcus said automatically, then realized he didn't know if that was still true. The old Marcus Wellington never quit, but who was this new version standing in a food cart at dawn, bleeding from amateur knife work? The first customers arrived at 7 a.m. sharp, construction workers heading to a nearby site, looking for quick breakfast before their shift. They ordered with the casual familiarity of regulars, and Sophia filled their orders while maintaining easy conversation about the weather, local news, the Knicks' latest disappointing loss. Marcus, you're on assembly, Sophia said. I'll grill, you build the tacos. 3 carnitas, 2 chorizo, 1 veggie. Remember the order: tortilla, meat, onions, cilantro, salsa, fast but careful. Go. Marcus's hands trembled as he reached for the first tortilla. He could feel the customers watching him, their schedule ticking away while he fumbled with toppings. The onions scattered across the workspace. He grabbed too much cilantro. The salsa dripped everywhere. Slower is faster, Sophia said quietly. Breathe. Focus on 1 taco at a time. Marcus forced himself to slow down, to concentrate on each movement. Tortilla, meat, onions, cilantro, salsa. He handed the first taco to Sophia, who wrapped it with practiced efficiency and passed it through the window. The customer took it without comment, but Marcus felt like he'd just completed a marathon. By the time the breakfast rush ended at 9 a.m., Marcus was drenched in sweat despite the cold November air. His feet screamed in protest, his back felt like it might never straighten again, and his hands were covered in a mixture of salsa, grease, and minor burns from accidentally touching hot metal. Sophia handed him a bottle of water. Take 10 minutes. Sit down before you fall down. Marcus collapsed onto a nearby crate, gulping the water like a drowning man finding air. Sophia worked beside him, cleaning and resetting for the lunch rush, her movements still efficient despite hours of labor. This is what you do every day? Marcus asked, genuine awe in his voice. 5 days a week, sometimes 6 when I need extra money. Sophia wiped down the griddle with casual expertise. My mother did it before me. When she first came from Mexico, she taught me everything. The recipes, the techniques, how to talk to customers, how to make them feel welcome. This cart put me through college, paid for my apartment, supports my daughter. You have a daughter? Something shifted in Sophia's expression, a protective instinct Marcus recognized despite never having children of his own. Isabella, she's 12, smart as hell and stubborn as her mother. Where is she now? School. She stays with my neighbor after classes until I close up at 7. It's not perfect, but we make it work. Sophia turned to face him fully. Why are you really here, Marcus? And don't give me that line about learning to make something real. Nobody goes from wearing $2,000 suits to working a food cart without a serious story. Marcus set down the water bottle, meeting her direct gaze. In his old life, he would have deflected, maintained his privacy, revealed only what served his purposes. But something about Sophia's honesty demanded the same in return. 2 weeks ago, I ran a hedge fund called Wellington Capital. We managed $3 billion. I had a penthouse in Midtown, vacation homes, cars, everything money could buy. He paused, the words difficult despite their truth. Then I found out my executives had been running a massive fraud scheme. They'd been creating false returns, stealing from investors, building a house of cards that eventually collapsed. I didn't know. I was so focused on expansion that I stopped paying attention to the details. But ignorance isn't innocence. Those people trusted me, and I failed them. Sophia listened without interruption, her face unreadable. When he finished, she nodded slowly. So you lost everything. Everything that mattered to the old me. Money, reputation, power. I'm cooperating with federal investigators, trying to help recover what can be recovered. But I'm also trying to figure out who I am when I'm not Marcus Wellington, master of the universe. He laughed bitterly. Turns out, I'm not very good at being a regular person. Nobody's good at it at first, Sophia said. Being normal takes practice when you're used to being exceptional, even if that exceptional was built on sand. She returned to her prep work, but her tone softened. You made 347 tacos this morning. Probably 200 of them were mistakes I had to fix, but you didn't quit. That counts for something. The lunch rush was worse than breakfast. Longer, more intense, with customers who were hungrier and less patient. Marcus burned himself twice more, dropped an entire container of pico de gallo, and accidentally used habanero salsa when someone asked for mild, leading to a memorable customer reaction and Sophia's stern reminder about paying attention to details. But he also started to find a rhythm. His hands began to remember the motions. He learned to anticipate Sophia's needs, passing her items before she asked. He discovered that smiling at customers, asking about their day, treating them like humans rather than transactions, made the work easier and more enjoyable. At 2 p.m., during a brief lull, a familiar voice made Marcus freeze. Well, Marcus Wellington, I heard you'd fallen far, but I didn't believe it until now. Marcus turned to find Richard Hastings, a rival hedge fund manager he'd spent years competing against in the ruthless world of high finance. Richard looked exactly as Marcus remembered. Expensive suit, perfect hair, smile that never reached his eyes. Behind him stood two younger men, probably junior analysts, watching the scene with undisguised curiosity. Richard, Marcus said evenly, acutely aware of his grease-stained apron and disheveled appearance. Making tacos now? How the mighty have fallen. Richard's voice carried loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. I always said you were overrated, Wellington. Guess the market finally figured it out too. Marcus felt his old instincts rising, the urge to defend himself, to attack back, to win at any cost. His hands clenched into fists, and he opened his mouth to deliver a cutting response that would remind Richard exactly who he was dealing with. Can I help you gentlemen with something? Sophia's voice cut through the tension like a knife. She'd moved beside Marcus, her posture protective, despite barely knowing him. We serve food here, not insults. Richard's smile widened. Just catching up with an old friend, though I suppose he needs all the friends he can get these days. He turned to his companions. Let's go somewhere that doesn't smell like failure. As they walked away, their laughter echoing down the street, Marcus realized he was shaking, not with anger, but with humiliation more complete than anything he'd experienced in his entire life. To be mocked in public, to have his downfall displayed for entertainment, to be powerless to strike back. Ignore him, Sophia said quietly. Men like that measure their worth by other people's pain. He's probably terrified he'll be next. You don't understand, Marcus said, his voice rough. That's what I was. That's exactly who I was. Someone who measured success by crushing competitors, by being on top while others fell. I did that to people. I enjoyed it. Sophia was quiet for a moment, then handed him a knife and a pile of tomatoes. Then don't be that anymore. People aren't defined by who they were. They're defined by who they choose to become. She gestured at the tomatoes. Dice these for the evening prep. Focus on the work. Everything else is just noise. Marcus picked up the knife, his hands steadier now. He'd spent 20 years believing that power and wealth defined worth, that the strong deserved to dominate the weak, that compassion was weakness and sentiment was failure. Now, standing in a food cart, wearing a stained apron and dicing tomatoes beside a woman who radiated quiet strength, he wondered if he'd been wrong about everything. The rest of the day passed in a blur of customers, prep work, and gradually improving competence. By the time Sophia closed the cart at 7 p.m., Marcus could barely stand. Every muscle ached. His clothes were ruined. His hands were covered in minor injuries. He'd never worked harder in his life. Sophia counted out $75 in cash, minimum wage for 8 hours, minus taxes she paid in cash, because Marcus didn't have official paperwork yet. You earned it. Barely, but you earned it. Same time tomorrow? Marcus took the money, staring at the bills that represented more honest work than he'd done in 2 decades. Same time tomorrow. As he walked back to the boarding house through the darkening streets, his entire body screaming in protest, Marcus thought about the day. He'd made approximately 800 tacos, served hundreds of people, learned more about real work than his entire Ivy League education had taught him. He'd been humiliated by a former rival and defended by a woman who barely knew him. He'd failed repeatedly and kept going anyway. $75. In his old life, that was nothing. What he spent on a bottle of wine without thinking. Now, it was everything. Proof that he could do something real, create something of value with his own hands, earn his place through labor rather than manipulation. Mrs. Chen was in the kitchen when Marcus arrived, and she took one look at his exhausted face and grease-stained clothes before ladling soup into a bowl without a word. He sat at the table beside Raymond, who was nursing a beer and working on a crossword puzzle. "Rough first day?" Raymond asked, not looking up from his puzzle. "The hardest day of my life," Marcus admitted. "But you went back for more tomorrow." "Yes." Raymond smiled and filled in another answer. "Then you're going to be okay. The people who make it aren't the ones who never fall. They're the ones who get up again." That night, Marcus lay in his narrow bed and looked at the $75 sitting on his dresser. In the cracked mirror, he could see his reflection, bruised, exhausted, humbled. The old Marcus Wellington would have been horrified by this version, would have seen it as the ultimate failure. But as he drifted towards sleep, surrounded by the sounds of the boarding house and the memory of Sophia's quiet strength, Marcus wondered if perhaps this broken, struggling version of himself was the most honest thing he'd ever been. And maybe, just maybe, honesty was worth more than all the success he'd lost. Tomorrow, he would wake at 4:15 and do it again. Not because he had to, but because for the first time in his life, he wanted to. Because Sophia had trusted him when she had no reason to. Because making something real, even something as simple as a perfect taco, mattered more than he'd ever imagined. The old Marcus Wellington was gone, destroyed by his own arrogance and neglect. But perhaps, in the steam and heat of a street food cart, a new Marcus was being born. One who understood that true worth wasn't measured in dollars or power, but in the simple dignity of honest work and human connection. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm that would have been unthinkable to the old Marcus Wellington. Wake at 4:15, work the cart until 7 p.m., return to the boarding house with aching feet and $75 in cash, eat Mrs. Chen's soup, sleep, repeat. His hands developed calluses. His expensive clothes gave way to jeans and work boots purchased from a discount store on Canal Street. The man in the mirror grew leaner, harder, more real. But something else was happening too. Something Marcus hadn't anticipated. He was learning Sofia Rodriguez, not in the calculated way he'd once studied business rivals, but in the organic accumulation of small moments that built into genuine understanding. He learned that she sang softly in Spanish while prepping vegetables, old songs her mother taught her, that she had a tell when worried. She'd touched the small gold cross at her neck, a gift from her daughter, that she remembered every regular customer's order and asked about their lives with genuine interest, not networking strategy, that she worked with a grace and efficiency that came from years of practice, but also from genuine love of the craft. He learned that Sofia Rodriguez was extraordinary in ways that had nothing to do with wealth or status or power, and everything to do with the quiet strength of someone who'd built a life through determination and care. And he learned with growing certainty that both thrilled and terrified him that he was falling in love with her. It was a cold Tuesday in early December when everything changed. Marcus arrived at 4:45 to find Sophia already at the cart. But something was wrong. Her movements were jerky, distracted. Her eyes were red, as if she'd been crying, though she'd clearly tried to hide it. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked, setting down his bag. "I'm fine," Sophia said automatically, not meeting his eyes. "We need to prep the chorizo first today. Supply delivery got delayed yesterday." "Sophia," I said, "I'm fine, Marcus. Can we just work?" They worked in silence, the easy camaraderie of recent weeks replaced by tension Marcus didn't understand. He wanted to push, to demand answers, but 3 weeks of learning honest work had also taught him something about respecting boundaries. So he chopped vegetables and stayed quiet, offering his presence as support even if she wouldn't accept his questions. The breakfast rush passed in strained quiet. Then, at 8:30, a black sedan pulled up to the curb, and a woman in an expensive suit emerged. She approached the cart with the confident stride of someone used to getting what she wanted, her eyes scanning the scene with obvious distaste. "Sofia Rodriguez?" she asked, her tone making the name sound like an accusation. Sophia's entire body tensed. "Who's asking?" "Catherine Morrison, Morrison and Associates." The woman handed Sophia a business card through the window. "I represent James Cordero. I believe you know him." The name meant nothing to Marcus, but Sophia's reaction spoke volume. Her face went pale, and her hand immediately went to the cross at her neck. "I have nothing to say to him or his lawyers," Sophia said, her voice tight. "My client is Isabella's father. He has rights, Ms. Rodriguez. He's filed for joint custody, and given your circumstances," Catherine gestured dismissively at the food cart, "a judge might find his home more stable for a 12-year-old girl. Isabella has a stable home. She has a mother who loves her, a community, a school where she's thriving. She has a mother who works 80-hour weeks at a street cart and lives in a one-bedroom apartment in a questionable neighborhood. Mr. Cordero can offer private schools, a house in Westchester, opportunities you could never provide." Catherine's smile was professionally sympathetic and completely cold. "He's willing to be generous, summers with you, alternating holidays. You'd still be her mother, just a more part-time version." "Get away from my cart," Sophia said, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. "Tell James that if he wants to see Isabella, he can start by paying the 12 years of child support he owes. Tell him that disappearing when I was pregnant and showing up now doesn't make him a father. Tell him, Ms. Rodriguez, emotion won't help your case. The preliminary hearing is scheduled for January 15th. I suggest you retain counsel." Catherine dropped another business card on the cart's counter. "Though I should warn you, custody battles are expensive, very expensive. My client has significant resources. Can you say the same?" She walked back to her sedan and drove away, leaving silence in her wake. Sophia stood, frozen, staring at the business card as if it were a live grenade. "Sophia," Marcus said gently, "talk to me. What just happened?" She looked at him, and the vulnerability in her eyes made Marcus's chest ache. "Isabella's father, James. We were together when I was 23. He was my first real relationship, and I thought he loved me. Then I got pregnant, and suddenly he had business opportunities in California, family emergencies, 1,000 excuses why he couldn't be there. He ghosted me completely. Wouldn't return calls, blocked my emails, sent back the letter I wrote telling him about Isabella's birth. And now he wants custody. His family has money, real money. His father owns half the real estate in Westchester County. James is," she laughed bitterly, "he's what you used to be, Marcus. Rich, powerful, used to getting what he wants. He married someone from the right family 3 years ago, and apparently they can't have children. So now he remembers he has a daughter." Marcus felt something cold and familiar stirring in his chest. The strategic mind that had built Wellington Capital, that had crushed competitors and won at any cost. But this time, it wasn't for his own gain. This time, it was for Sophia and the daughter he'd never met, but already knew was everything to her. "How much do you need?" he asked. "What? For a lawyer, a good one who can fight this. How much?" Sophia shook her head. "Marcus, I can't. I'm not offering charity. I'm asking a question. How much?" "I spoke to a lawyer last week when I got the initial papers. She said retainer alone would be 15,000, and that's before court costs, expert witnesses, all the rest. It could go up to 50,000 or more if it goes to trial." Her voice cracked. "I have 8,000 saved. That's it. 12 years of saving every extra dollar, and it's not even close to enough. $50,000. To the old Marcus, that was nothing. What he spent on a weekend getaway. To the new Marcus, it was insurmountable. He had exactly $2,347 saved from 3 weeks of work at the cart, plus what remained of his original cash after paying Mrs. Chen. But Marcus Wellington had spent 20 years building networks, understanding how money moved, knowing who had it and who owed favors. That knowledge didn't disappear just because his fortune did. "I can help," he said. With what? You're working a food cart for minimum wage. You're barely getting by yourself. I still have contacts, people who might listen to me despite everything. Let me make some calls. Sophia studied him for a long moment, and Marcus could see the battle playing out behind her eyes. Pride versus desperation, independence versus need. Finally, she nodded. Why would you do this? You barely know me. Because I love you, Marcus thought, but didn't say. Instead, he offered a truth that was almost as vulnerable. Because you gave me a chance when no one else would. Because you're teaching me how to be a decent human being. Because it's the right thing to do. That evening, Marcus sat in his small room with his phone and a list of names he'd compiled from memory. Most of his old contacts wouldn't take his call. He knew that. He was toxic now, associated with fraud and failure. But there had to be someone, somewhere, who remembered the man he'd been before the corruption, who might listen long enough for him to make his case. He started with the least likely and worked his way up. James Harrison, a former client, disconnected call. Patricia Wong, an old colleague, straight to voicemail. David Schwartz, a competitor who'd once respected him, secretary said he was unavailable and would remain so permanently. Marcus worked through 15 names before someone finally answered. Wellington? Is this actually Marcus Wellington? The voice belonged to Thomas Chen, a venture capitalist Marcus had advised in the early days of his career, before Wellington Capital became the empire it briefly was. It's me, Thomas. I know you've probably heard. I heard. Whole damn world heard. You calling to borrow money? Because I've got to tell you, your credit's not looking good right now. I'm not calling for myself. I'm calling about someone who needs help, someone who deserves it more than anyone I've ever met. Marcus explained Sophia's situation, carefully leaving out the depth of his feelings, but making clear the injustice of what she faced. He talked about Isabella, the daughter who'd never known her father until he decided she was convenient. He explained how James Cordero was using his wealth as a weapon, how the system was rigged against single mothers who'd worked themselves to exhaustion providing loving homes. "And what do you want from me?" Thomas asked when Marcus finished. "Connect me with a lawyer, someone good who might take the case pro bono or reduced fee. I know you sit on the board of legal aid. I know you have connections. Why should I help you? You're a pariah, Marcus. Your name is poison in financial circles. Don't help me. Help Sophia Rodriguez and her daughter. They had nothing to do with Wellington Capital. They're just people trying to live their lives, about to be crushed by someone with more money than conscience." Marcus paused. "You have 3 daughters, Thomas. What would you want someone to do if they were in Isabella's position?" The silence stretched for what felt like hours. Finally, Thomas sighed. "I know someone. Rebecca Ling, family law specialist. She's tough, expensive, and very selective about her cases. I can't promise she'll take it, but I can get you a meeting. That's all I'm asking. Thank you, Thomas." "Marcus, one more thing. I never bought that you knew about the fraud. You were a lot of things, arrogant, ruthless, cold, but you weren't a thief. Whatever you're doing now, working a food cart or whatever, maybe it's good for you. Maybe we all need to fall before we figure out how to be decent." The call ended, and Marcus sat in the darkness of his room, staring at his phone. Thomas was right. The fall had been necessary. The old Marcus Wellington could never have made that call, could never have asked for help, could never have cared enough about another person's pain to humble himself so completely. 3 days later, Marcus and Sophia sat in Rebecca Ling's Manhattan office, a space that reminded Marcus painfully of his old life, all polished wood and leather furniture and windows overlooking the city. Rebecca herself was in her mid-50s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a direct manner that somehow managed to be both intimidating and reassuring. "Thomas Chen says you need help," Rebecca said, looking at Sophia. "Tell me everything and don't leave anything out. I need to know exactly what we're dealing with." Sophia told her story, the relationship with James, the pregnancy, his abandonment, 12 years of raising Isabella alone while working endless hours to provide a good life. She talked about her daughter's straight A's, her love of reading, her kindness to younger children. She showed Rebecca pictures on her phone, a beautiful girl with Sophia's eyes and a smile that could light up rooms. "He wants her now," Sophia said, her voice steady despite the pain underneath. "Not because he loves her or misses her or wants to be her father, because his wife can't have children and I'm a convenient solution, because he can afford to take her and I can't afford to fight him." Rebecca listened without interruption, taking notes on a legal pad. When Sophia finished, she turned to Marcus. "And what's your role in this, Mr. Wellington? Thomas said you were advocating for Ms. Rodriguez." "I work for Sophia at her food cart. She's shown me more about integrity and strength in 3 weeks than I learned in 20 years of business. I called Thomas because I knew she needed help I couldn't provide on my own. Can you afford my retainer? It's typically $15,000. Marcus saw Sophia's face fall, watched her prepare to stand and politely excuse herself. Before she could, he spoke. "What if we structured it differently? I have contacts, resources from my old life. I can't pay you in cash, but I can offer consultation on investments, financial analysis, connections to potential clients. I know my reputation is damaged, but my knowledge isn't." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "You're offering to trade services for legal representation." "I'm offering whatever it takes to help Sophia keep her daughter." Rebecca studied them both for a long moment, her sharp eyes moving between Sophia's desperate hope and Marcus's determined intensity. Finally, she smiled. "Thomas said you'd changed, Wellington. I didn't believe him, but maybe he was right." She turned to Sophia. "I'll take your case. No retainer, no upfront costs. If we win, you pay me 10% of whatever you can afford over the next 5 years. If we lose, you owe me nothing. Fair?" Sophia's eyes filled with tears. "Why would you do that?" "Because Thomas Chen doesn't call in favors lightly. Because I have a daughter too, and I remember how hard it was being a single mother before I made partner. And because," she gestured at Marcus, "if Marcus Wellington is working a food cart and trading financial advice for legal fees, something interesting is happening here. I want to see where it goes." The preliminary hearing was set for January 15th, 6 weeks away. Rebecca outlined their strategy. They'd emphasize Isabella's stability, Sophia's dedication, James's 12-year absence. They'd paint him as an opportunist who wanted a daughter as an accessory, not a child to love and raise. "It won't be easy," Rebecca warned. "James Cordero has money, connections, and a 2-parent household. Judges sometimes favor that, even when it's wrong. We need to make it clear that wealth doesn't equal love, and absence doesn't disappear just because someone decides to show up with a checkbook." Over the following weeks, Marcus threw himself into preparing for the case with the same intensity he'd once applied to market analysis. He worked the cart with Sophia during the day, then spent evenings researching custody law, compiling documentation of Sophia's parenting, gathering character references from neighbors and customers and teachers. He also got to know Isabella, who'd been told about the custody battle and was, according to Sophia, terrified of losing the only parent she'd ever known. Marcus met her one Saturday at the cart, a slender girl with curious eyes and her mother's quiet strength. "Mom says you're helping us," Isabella said, studying Marcus with the directness of children. "Why?" "Because your mother is the best person I've ever met, and you deserve to stay with her." "Are you Mom's boyfriend?" The question caught Marcus off guard, and he glanced at Sophia, who was suddenly very interested in cleaning the already clean griddle. "I'm your mother's friend and employee," Isabella grinned. "Mom doesn't have male friends. She's too busy working to have any friends at all. So either you're lying about being friends, or you're something else." Smart kid, Marcus thought. Sophia's intelligence combined with youth's unfiltered honesty. "What do you want me to be?" he asked. Isabella considered this seriously. "I want you to be someone who makes my mom smile. She doesn't smile enough, but she smiles when she talks about you, even when she's trying to pretend she's just talking about work." That night, after the cart was closed and Isabella had gone home with Sophia's neighbour, Marcus and Sophia walked through the Lower East Side together. It had become their routine, a quiet half-hour before they parted ways, walking through streets that had become familiar, talking about the day, or sometimes not talking at all. "Isabella likes you," Sophia said. "That's rare. She doesn't trust easily, especially men. She's seen too many people disappoint me. She's remarkable, smart, brave, honest, like her mother." Sophia stopped walking and turned to face him. They were standing under a streetlight on Orchard Street, the December cold turning their breath to fog, the city alive around them with sound and light and endless movement. "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me, always. Why are you really doing this, all of this? The job, the case, the help with Isabella. Is it guilt? Are you trying to be a better person by fixing me? Because I don't need fixing, and I don't need to be anyone's redemption project." Marcus could have lied or deflected or hidden behind the walls he'd built over 20 years. Instead, he chose the terrifying vulnerability of complete truth. "I'm doing it because somewhere between learning to dice onions and getting burned by hot tortillas, I fell in love with you." The words hung in the cold air between them. "I know I have no right to feel that way. I know I'm a disaster of a human being who's barely figured out how to function in the real world. I know you have every reason to see me as a temporary employee and nothing more. But you asked for honesty, so here it is. I love you, Sofia Rodriguez. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you make every customer feel seen. I love that you sing while you work and remember everyone's name and taught your daughter to be brave. I love that you gave me a chance when I deserved nothing, and I'm helping because when you love someone, you help them. No conditions, no expectations, no redemption required, just love." Sophia stared at him, her dark eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, Marcus was certain he'd ruined everything, that his confession had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Then she smiled, not the polite smile she gave customers or the tired smile she wore after long days, but a genuine, radiant expression that transformed her entire face. "You're an idiot, Marcus Wellington," she said softly. "I know. You fell in love with your boss who pays you minimum wage to make tacos. Yes, you have terrible timing. I'm in the middle of a custody battle, working 80-hour weeks, barely holding my life together. I know that too. And you're still figuring out who you are without all the money and power. You might wake up tomorrow and realize you miss your old life, that this was just a phase. That won't happen." Sophia stepped closer, close enough that Marcus could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes, could smell the faint scent of cilantro and spices that clung to her hair. "How can you be so sure?" "Because the old life was empty. It was numbers and competition and winning at everything except being human. This," he gestured at the street around them, the cart, the life they'd built in 3 weeks. "This is real. You're real. What I feel for you is the most real thing I've ever experienced." Sophia reached up and touched his face, her calloused fingers gentle against his skin. "I can't promise you anything, Marcus. I can't be what you might want me to be. I'm a single mother with a food cart and a custody battle and a life that's messy and complicated. I don't want promises. I just want to be here, helping you, learning from you, being with you, however that looks." She kissed him then, standing under the streetlight on Orchard Street while the city moved around them. It was soft and brief and tasted like hope. And Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside his chest, a wall crumbling, a door opening, a heart he'd thought was dead discovering it could still beat. When they pulled apart, Sophia was smiling. "You're still an idiot. The best kind, though. Maybe. We'll see." She took his hand, her fingers threading through his. "Come on. Mrs. Chen makes the best dumplings on Saturdays, and you're too skinny. A woman can't fall for a man who looks like he'd blow away in a strong wind." As they walked back toward the boarding house together, hands clasped, Marcus thought about the journey that had brought him here. From penthouse to food cart, from arrogance to humility, from isolation to love. He'd lost everything that the old Marcus Wellington valued, but he'd found something infinitely more precious, a reason to be better, a purpose beyond profit. And a woman who saw him not as he'd been or as he appeared, but as he was becoming. The custody battle still loomed. His future was uncertain. His savings wouldn't last forever, and he had no idea what came after the cart. But for the first time in his life, Marcus Wellington was exactly where he belonged, walking through the streets of the Lower East Side with a woman who taught him that real wealth had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with love, honesty, and the courage to start again.